Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Girish. I am from the Institute of Supply Chain Management, and I welcome you to this fifth edition of Supply Chain Prism. Supply Chain Prism is a unique offering from the Institute of Supply Chain Management, where we invite global thought leaders to speak about some of the current challenges in supply chain and how global thought leaders are viewing this whole challenge. It's a very simple format. We have an invited thought leader who would be in candid conversation with Dr. Rakesh Singh, who is the chairman of the Institute of Supply Chain Management. For this edition of the Supply Chain Prism, we have chosen transforming supply chains as our theme. And the invited thought leader is Dr. John Gattorna, an author, a researcher, an academic, and a person who has been passionately involved with all things supply chain and has written a series of books on supply chain management, culminating in what is the latest offering of his, which is transforming supply chains, realign your business to better serve customers in a disruptive world. He has co-authored this book, a colleague of long time, Deborah Ellis. His other books are there for you to see. You have the Dynamic Supply Chains in 2010. In 2009, he came out with Dynamic Supply Chain Alignment. In 2006, Living Supply Chains. A very prolific author. We are fortunate indeed to have Dr. John Gattorna share his ideas on how we can transform supply chains. I would now invite Dr. Rakesh Singh, Chairman, Institute of Supply Chain Management, to take over the discussions, and we all look forward to a very candid and very helpful discussion. To you, Dr. Singh.
John, and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the fifth edition of Supply Chain Prism, where, as Girish rightly said, we converse with a global thought leader on certain ideas within the domain of supply chain management. Today, we have John Gattorna, who has a complete strategic view of supply chain management and brings to his credit the very first time the dynamic alignment was talked in supply chains in a big way. Living Supply Chains, Dynamic Supply Chain in 2015. His book on dynamic supply chain has been a classic, a masterpiece, which paved way for thinking how traditional supply chains needs to change. While the world is talking about disruption, John was talking about traditional supply chain in a similar manner when he looked at geopolitical realities, economic nationalism, natural disasters, and many other changes that follow because of technological changes. And he wrote a book called Transforming Supply Chain, and how to transform your supply chain, enhance customer service, bring a complete outside in view of supply chains within the design of your supply chain, and make supply chain agile, or he may say multiple supply chain characteristics within the domain. To begin the discussion, I would ask John that even today, this book was written before the pandemic, so the topic has not changed much, and that goes to the credit of John Gattorna, primarily because he understood what plagued supply chains, what ails supply chain, and how do we really bring the element of dynamism. Dynamic alignment was the element of dynamism into the overall strategic planning of business, and specifically into the lifeline of business, which everyone of us know how important is. That's called supply chain management. John, let me go straight to this one simple question.
Yep.
What what is the real problem with the traditional supply chain, which got exposed because of technological change on the one hand, and also because of disruptions called the pandemic on the other hand?
Yep. Thanks very much, Rakesh and Girish, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak to everyone in India. It's a few years since I've been there, and I hope I can get back there before too long as well. But look, to be very blunt, the last 50 years of what I would call scientific management of supply chain, we've been going in one direction. We've been searching for that ideal one-size-fits-all, very much driven by an internal need for efficiency in the business and reducing cost, and not really seriously worrying about what customers genuinely want. And of course, the whole globalization movement over the last 10 or 20 years hasn't helped. We've had procurement managers searching the world for the cheapest product. Of course, that means long supply chains. It means very vulnerable supply chains. We've been centralizing production. We've been, centralizing distribution centers and rationalizing our network and doing all those things. And what we've been doing, even before COVID, we've been making our supply chains very vulnerable to disruption. And of course, it had to happen. We've had disruptions in the last 50 years. We've had, we've had SARS, we've had various other regional disasters, and the world oil crisis in 1973, but nothing quite like this. And I think it's been a real lesson for us, and it's driven a lot of people to really rethink what they're doing with their supply chain, and that's really why so many people now are seriously thinking about how to transform their business going forward. Because if you listen to people like Jim Collins, the management guru, who's writes a lot about these things and about what's happening in the operating environment for businesses around the world, he says that we are now entering a long period of ferocious instability. And I want you to remember those two words, ferocious instability, which means that the way we've operated before is just not adequate. It's too unreliable. And at the same time, our customers are getting more demanding. So something really has to change radically. And the question then is, how do we start? And the answer to that is, and we'll get to that in a bit more detail later, I think, Rakesh, we must start from the customer end. The big lie that's been out there for the last 50 years is that we understand our customers and we take a view of them, and then we go back inside the business, we get involved in process re-engineering, we get involved in putting in ERP systems around the turn of the century. We start putting in all sorts of applications that may or may not talk. And what we've been really doing is not getting a continuous view of our customers. Visibility's been patchy, and we certainly have not been getting anywhere near the so-called customer centricity that so many businessmen think that they have. And so the big starting point, I think, is we've got to find a way to directly connect with our customers, understand what they're trying to tell us in terms of their needs, and then reverse engineer back into our business using our customer base as our frame of reference. And then we can do all the things that we've been doing: process re-engineering, changing our organization design, putting in KPIs, bringing in a portfolio of technologies, developing training and development. All these things are absolutely valid, but in the past we've been treating them as ad hoc rather than as part of a methodology, a systematic methodology that's going to get us in genuine alignment with our customers. Because the one thing I can tell you, if we don't align with our customers, we end up over-servicing some customers, which means it's costing us a lot, and we're putting a lot of money and investment into things where we don't get the return, or we're under-servicing other customers, which means we're disappointing customers and we're not getting the revenue we should. So So really, it's a business problem. It's something businesses have to think about, and then within their businesses, they have to recognise that really most businesses are made up of threads that join the business to their customer base, like the central nervous system in the body. So that's, I think, Rakesh, we've had a wake-up call. And I would argue that companies that are not well and truly reviewing the way they service their customers are going to be left in the dust, because our customers are outstripping us in terms of their demands.
That's a good start, John. But there's a very interesting part in your book which I read it. Adopt or die. What are the dimensions of adoption that needs to be taken into account? We've already said outside in view as a design, but what are the critical areas where organizations need to really start their supply chains from? And you say the transformation generally starts from here.
Well, you know, obviously supply chains are networks, and we have a network of suppliers at the back end, but you know, we really have to start with our network of customers. So what we've done is devised a method of segmentation called behavioural segmentation. The problem we've had in the past is that we've been using the wrong segmentation. We've been segmenting on size, segmenting on profitability, segmenting on industry type, and all those methods are our language to describe our customers. What we need is a method called behavioural segmentation, which, by the way, marketing people know about but have been keeping it from us in the supply chain, using conjoint analysis techniques, trade-off techniques, which are used by companies like Unilever when they do their consumer research, etc., where you actually can determine amongst a large customer base, and we've done this, that there are no more than 4 or 5 groups of customers with certain buying behaviours that will account for about 80% of your target market. So this answers the question: if one size fits all is not a right, how many supply chains do you need? And what we found is that in our research across the world and across many industries, because there were no books written on this when we started working on it in the mid-90s, that there are about 16 behavioural types. It cuts across geographic boundaries and cultural boundaries, because we're all human beings. But you don't need 16. We reckon we can get it down to about 4 or 5. Now, 4 of those are what I call appealing to business as usual. So there'll be some customers that are relationship. They like the relationship. We call that the collaborative supply chain that connects with them. There's those customers who like low cost and reliability. That's the lean supply chain. There's those customers who like quick response, as you know, and we call that the agile supply chain. So we know about those, but we didn't tend to think about collaborative customers before. And there were those customers who, you know, in big projects, it's a totally different way of handling things rather than making discrete products. So, you know, those 4 are what I call business as usual. But there's a 5th, which we use in times of major disruption, which, as you say, Rakesh, we developed that some years ago, mainly for humanitarian disasters or things of that nature, which applies now for COVID, where you have a group of people quite separate in the organisation, not tied by all the policies and rules in the other part of the organisation, who just get together like the SAS and think about how to solve the problem in hand, which is how do we get manufacturing going? How do we overcome our shortages of raw materials and solve that problem? Or it could be launch of a new product, you know, that haven't previously been. So it implies innovation and creativity, and you need a whole different mindset to run that. And I think those 2 sort of sub-organisations have got to be kept apart, because if you try to incorporate innovation into the business as usual, you distract the business as usual people from routine, and they can't do it anyhow, and you distract and inhibit the people who are trying to innovate with too many rules and routines. So you probably now understand what I'm saying is this is an enterprise-wide problem, and organisation design is a critical factor. You've got to get that right.
I think, John, that's a very interesting point when you say that there is a multiple supply chain framework that organization needs to really adopt. One size fits all does not really matter much. Uh, as we have seen it in India, because of the nature of the product and product segmentation itself, even planning requires a different approach within an organization in a multiple strategic fit. And what you see is that there are some products which could be very seasonal, like your traditional lean supply chain. They may require, some products are highly dynamic and they may need some agility or some amount of implied uncertainty is there, so agility. And some require a huge responsiveness in terms of big customers which have a chunk of orders. So within
Yeah.
a single organization, also we see multiple supply chain. I think this is what
Yeah.
is a great learning from your earlier books, which we have applied in our consulting and training. Uh,
Yeah.
when you talk about this multiple supply chains and when you are moving ahead with the kind of transformation that the market has gone
Yeah.
in terms of what we call it as pandemic has hastened the overall need for companies to enhance their supply chain transformation process, as you rightly said. And within this, we have seen a dramatic change in the consumer behavior. There's huge literature available across the globe which converges towards changes in consumer behavior, changes in channel dynamics, brand dynamics, shopping trips, and also the packaging types and the sizes. And then a great movement and a very hastened movement towards e-commerce, from
Yeah.
modern retail to the e-commerce. All these changes has actually led to a situation where one needs a very different definition in terms of what you call it as customer services. And also no supply chain, as you rightly say, can evolve itself. It needs to be designed. So what are your prescriptions now going forward this? Because you've given the 5 different kind of supply chain that exist in the process, but given the kind of speed, and I think one thing that is really very important in your book, where you are talking about faster clock speeds, I think how do you really see these changes and outside in changes behavior, which may drive the design of the supply chain in future?
Okay. Well, it depends on what market you're in, but clearly companies like Zara in the fashion business, which is a very, very tough business in terms of cycle time, have learnt this lesson. A lot of industrial companies are struggling still. The best of the industrial companies, people like Schneider Electric, have already understood this. But what I'm suggesting now as a basic thought is that in order to keep up with the changing, demanding customer, whether they be industrial customers or consumers, we have to get the clock speed of our organizations running faster. Now, that's different from being agile and standing stationary and getting a demand for a product and doing all sorts of special things to get that product to the customer. What we're talking about here is lifting the rhythm of the organization through process reengineering, through digitization of the complete sort of supply chain from the company out to the customer and from the company back to the supplier, so you can see what's going on, you can make quicker decisions. Because if you recall, the clock speed idea came from Charles Fine back 20 years ago, but he didn't have any of this digital stuff that we've got now. He was mainly studying the fruit fly and how they evolve quickly and so on. What we've now got is rapid development of digitization, which connects all the dots. And unfortunately, we've got companies, and I'd say a lot of them in India, where they've got big ERP systems, they've got other applications sitting on top of these. They're not really talking to each other. No one's got a clear view from the company, even inside the company, between functions, let alone outside to the customer. And so one of the first things I think you've got to do is literally map out what our systems are, where our systems are there and where the gaps are, and start filling those gaps with other applications which may well be fairly cheap, you know, Internet of Things type applications for tracking and tracing and things of that nature. There's so much new stuff out there which runs on IoT, which is nothing compared to the GSM costs, you know, the costs you incur if you're running through networks of telecoms. So my view is that there's an underlying lean necessity in every organisation. So you've got a network of DCs and factories and things. Yes, we've got to run them in the lowest cost way, but sitting on top of that, we've got to have the capability to connect with our customers relationship-wise, or in a speed sense through agility, or through project management, or so it's a combination, if you like, of achieving efficiency across the board in part of our network, and then having the capabilities which are different built into different teams which focus on the different segments outside in the outside world. So you get the best of both worlds. You get some efficiency and you get some connection. Where we've gone wrong in the past, we've been trying to get efficiency all the way through, and in the process, we've not been connecting with our customers because some customers didn't want efficiency. They were happy to pay more to get what they wanted.
All this you have been also talking in terms of what I said earlier was dynamic alignment. And you mentioned in a lot of your writings that dynamic alignment helps us see pattern in the market and the demand data and respond with precision. I think this is something what we're talking about, digitization as a process.
Yes.
How do you look at dynamic alignments, and how do you look at dynamic alignment as an element of supply chain transformation?
Well, you know, dynamic alignment really is the big architecture. If you once you whatever market you're in, it doesn't matter whether you're Shell and you're in the lubricants market, or you're Schneider Electric and you're in the electrical components and the energy market. You have a number of customers out there in a big database. It could be 3,000 or 4,000 customers, which we've been giving much the same offer. What we've got to do is break them up into segments. And once we know that 10% of our customers broadly are relationship driven, 40% are lean, 40% have agile capability tendencies, and and 10% of project. There are characteristics of these sorts of demands which we can reverse back in, and it changes the way the sort of processes that we have. For instance, you do a lot of work in supply chain planning, Rakesh, right? So if you were advising a company around supply chain planning and they had 40% of their customers were, say, looking for that low-cost, reliable product, then you'd be looking very much at understanding the forecast and the demand plan for customers who buy in a repeat way, and they don't share information with you, but you sort of know that broadly they buy the same thing, therefore you can forecast at the product level. But if you've got customers out there who are demanding and they want this one day and this the other day, you can't use that. You've got to then do what Zara does and say, well, hang on, what we'll now do is we'll forecast the capacity we need, not the SKU. So how much space do we need to book in a 3PL or an airline? How much space do we need, on a ship for next month's? We don't know what we're going to give them, but we know we'll book the space ahead, and then when the time comes, we'll tell them this is what we want you to take where. So the right down to the micro level inside the business, once you understand the different characteristics and demand characteristics, which, as you say, you can get from your data, your demand data, you can for your order data, and there's a lot of analytics that can be done on that as well. It gives you a clue, or more than a clue, it gives you a guide as to how you design your different processes, your different KPIs, because the KPIs for the team that's running the lean supply chain is different from the KPIs running the agile supply chain, right? Or the KPIs running the collaborative supply chain is all about looking after customers and retaining customers. They're all different. So throw away all the books on long lists of KPIs And just once you've understood the 4 or 5 supply chains that run through your business, then set up teams focused on them and measure them on different settings. And underneath that, you've got, still have your functions, but your functions are not dominant because your functions are managing the verticals, but the supply chain teams are managing the horizontal flows, which cut across those functions. And I think that's been the big problem in the past. We've been asking our functional structures to manage the verticals and the horizontals at the same time, and you can't do it. It's become very obvious, and I've laid this out in a lot of detail in the book, for every type of supply chain, there's different combinations of processes, technologies, types of teams, right down to the subcultures that you need to develop in order to get that alignment with those different subgroups. And then, of course, it all gets more complicated because someone who's a lean customer, predominantly, forgets something and suddenly moves across, and their buying behavior tomorrow is agile, okay? So they need to be treated with a different supply chain. So we've got to have groups inside the business who are constantly recognizing that customers are moving as well. They're not stationary, depending on the situation they find themselves in. And I think that's been the big problem, I think, in the past, that marketing people have been trying to convince us that once you describe a customer, they stay like that for the rest of their lives. Well, that's not right. Customers change depending on the situation they find themselves in and the type of product category they're buying. And they can have 4 or 5 different buying behaviors depending on whether they're buying schools for their kids, or entertainment, or airlines, or electric light bulbs, or groceries. And then on top of that, they can change depending on whether they can't find those things, and they'll change brands and things. So that's why this whole thing has been very difficult. But with the 5 supply chains, you know, hardwired into the business, we reckon we've got it sorted, because it doesn't matter whether the customers move up and down and go from the relationship to lean or agile or demanding and move down. We just pull different levers depending on where they are at the point in time. And you just need people to train people in the organisation to recognise when customers are in particular mindsets. So it's a mix of behavioural understanding as well as technology, and that's the bit. It's the hard and the soft comes together, and that's why I tried to originally call this the living supply chain, but no one would understood what I meant. So that's why we went to using the term dynamic supply chain.
But let me, take the discussion a little into your own thinking and your own models. In dynamic supply chains, you call it as people-centered supply chain, and I think you're talking about living supply chains in the same manner. Can you give us an idea about how important are people-centered supply chain, and what does it really mean to be a people-centered supply chain? To be
you know, I mean, when you think about it, in a supply chain, you've got people at the front end we call customers, who are making decisions about whether they're going to buy our product or service. We've got people at the back end called suppliers, who we tend to ignore, but they're still behaviour, and we've done a lot of research on that back end as well. And there are suppliers who have expectations about how they want to sell their product. Some want maximum price, some don't want that, they just want continuity or long-term contracts, or they want help with creativity or market intelligence. So there's different expectations at the back end. And then inside the business itself, we've got thousands of people who are making decisions every day about make or buy or whatever it is, stock levels and so on. So, I mean, from my work, I'm saying, and I'll pull a figure out of the air here for you, 60 to 70% of what goes on inside businesses is people-driven decision-making, behavioural sort of stuff, which is not taught very well in universities, and hasn't up to now really figured in the whole design of supply chains. And this is what I'm trying to change. I'm trying to say, by getting a map of your marketplace, once you've understood the different groupings of buying behaviours and expectations, They don't change rapidly. They move around a little bit, but they don't change that rapidly because people's values don't change. They change their behaviour if they have to for short periods of time, but they don't change their internal values. So once you've latched onto that, you've got something to work with, and then you can reverse engineer back with some confidence that you can start building your infrastructure and making decisions about your network and your service levels and your technology needs with a lot more confidence than we have in the past, where we've done things by trial and error and spent a lot of money and then found out it didn't make any difference to customer satisfaction. Because the ultimate measurement is that external measurement, which is customer satisfaction. And if you look at companies like Schneider Electric, who have really bought into this whole alignment thing over the last 8 or 9 years, not only have they taken $1 billion out of their global supply chain, but they've increased their top line by 2 or 3% directly due to higher customer satisfaction, which in turn is due to the fact that the supply chain has been able to deliver a differential product.
John, this is a big dilemma, and I think you start writing somewhere very clearly that the business executive and leaders, they do not stop, they do not rethink, they do not introspect, and hence they do not plan. And what happens exactly is that then they are actually looking at supply chains and are fascinated by new supply chains, but they are more, they get into the routine of doing the same thing on and off and do some incremental changes. What, according to you, should change to make this a possible assimilation of new ideas in supply chain for executing and transforming supply chain?
Right. Look, I am absolutely convinced the most important word, if you like, in management, in my view, is the single word leadership. And if you look at the alignment sort of structure, the way it works is it says there's 4 things you've got to line up. You've got to understand your marketplace. Secondly, you've got to respond to that marketplace with strategies, including supply chain strategies, pricing strategies. The third thing is you've got to configure your internal subcultures to underpin those words on paper. And fourthly, you've got to have a leadership that will shape the culture to drive the strategies into the marketplace. So what does that say? It basically says that the best companies in the world today are those where the leadership team understands its marketplace. They're the 2 pivotal things. And if the marketplace changes, it means the management or the leadership team has either got to evolve, or what happens probably better, things get bad in companies like, say, General Electric and others. They get rid of certain members and chief execs, and they bring in a different leader for the time. So I'm a great believer in leadership. The season, every leadership style has a season, has an applicability, and people who are good leaders in those high growth times are fine, but we need a totally different sort of leader in volatile times. So I think that we're heading into a period now where leaders who are around in the 80s and 90s are not going to be able to cope with the volatility and the things that have to be done and the tough decisions around organisation design and digitization, things like that. So you ask me what changes? Well, we take our measurement of what changes in the market, and if we're getting more demanding customers and they want shorter lead times, you've got to find leaders who can actually bring together an organisation and recruit people who actually will come up with the strategies and drive those sorts of strategies into the marketplace. There's no other way of doing it.
John, I think that takes me to the another area of transformation that people talk about, and even you have talked about in your book, decision making at a faster clock speed. You did talk about it, but the core of it is decision support systems, analytics, and tools for faster decision making. And you talked about digital, strategy. You talked about digitization. How decision system analytics and other tools in the digital arena are going to transform supply chain, and what are the critical balance that they could bring to the whole problem of resiliency?
Yeah. Look, you can't even start to make decisions unless you can see what's going on in your supply chain. And there's too many discontinuities and disconnections at the moment with our systems, and we don't really have visibility of our product as it moves through our internal functions and onto the customer. The first thing I would do is sit down and map our systems, find out where the gaps are, find out where the pain points are, effectively develop a what we would call an end-to-end supply chain mapped out, and then we put a digital twin in place. In other words, you having understood all the physical sort of activities. It could be something in the factory, something on transport, something goes on in a DC, something happens on a ship. When you've mapped those out, then you look and see what you've got digitally to give you the information, and you'll find you've got all sorts of gaps. So you start creating a digital twin that gives you that continuous view, and that by the time when you get that in place, that's going to give you data at every point. It's going to tell you when your product is stationary, when it's moving on an E3PL, when it's stationary in another DC. You can use all rather efficient tracking devices now which run off IoT, and so it's possible to do that. Now, what does that do? I haven't said this to, I think I mentioned in the book, but I haven't said it as strongly as I am going to say now. Every company of any size needs to aim at having a control tower. Now, the control tower is like at an airport. You've got a bunch of people in a room, they've got screens, they're getting feeds on real-time data, they can see what's happening with the orders, they get exceptions thrown up when something gets delayed, they are able to contact the customer proactively and tell them that we've been delayed and we're trying to fix it for you. And you can run these control towers on that sort of monitoring everything that's going on a 24-hour cycle. Later on, Rakesh, once you get on top of that 24-hour cycle, you can start looking at 1 to 2 months and start thinking about incorporating planning. But before you even get to using this type of control tower for planning purposes, you've got to get it going in a very executional way so that you're getting data real time and responding to customers before they even ask you what's going on. And I think that's the test. If companies can build an understanding of what they've got, they can see where the gaps are, they can start building a digital twin made up of different digital applications and make sure it's end-to-end, and they can track an order from the time it's placed to the time it's delivered, including proof of delivery, then you have the basis for controlling your business. If you can't do that, you're going to be dead in the water unless, in the meantime, you ask a 4PL like Tuna Nagel or someone like that who can come in and help bridge across for 2 or 3 years. They can bring in the technology while you're help you keep going for a couple of years while you build your own technology. But this sort of stuff takes a couple of years to build the technology and sort out where all the gaps are. But you've got to start somewhere. If you don't start now, I can tell you within 5 years you'll be out of the market.
John, that's a good point, and everybody is talking about control tower connected planning. What would be the role of 3PL? I have known you for long, and we have had various discussion on the 3PL's preparedness for this digitization. And what do you think would be the future of 3PLs within the supply chain in terms of this transformation? There's one report by a IT major saying that the logistics is going to be subsumed in the supply chain of control towers. So what are your views on that? And how does one really look at this kind of control tower and something where we get a very resilient planning methods and supply chain optimization through one, visibility, and second, you call it as transparency and real-time data.
Yeah, look, 3PLs are always going to be needed because there are lots of companies out there that don't want to own their own transport fleet and so on. But we're working with a company, an industrial company in Mexico right now, advising. They've got something like 900 transport companies that work for them because they're made up of, 2s and 3s and 4s, family-owned small fleets, etc. But they've got to be controlled, and the way this is being done now more and more is inserting inside each of those loads that go out the tracking devices, and those tracking devices feed back to the control tower. So in real time, people sitting in the control tower are seeing exactly where the order is, right down to the order and the package, and they can see where the trucks are and everything else. So I think the going forward, 3PLs are going to be heavily managed, whether they're big or small. They're going to have to tap into or be managed by the company that owns the product, who has the control tower. I think their degrees of freedom are going to be relatively constrained. The only other exceptions are those who step up and have got a sort of 4PL structure, which they don't own 3PL trucks, they own technology, and they are prepared to bring in different 3PLs and manage them. That's another opportunity that some companies will take, but there's not a lot of them around. Schenker's got one, Kuehne+Nagel Integrated Logistics, there's a few, but they're quite different to the classic 3PL. There will always be a role for the 3PL, but the 3PLs are going to be managed much more tightly using digitization, real time, back through into the control tower, where it's all going to happen.
Maybe the future looks very bright with a lot of efficient startups into logistics technology, and logistics control tower are going to redefine the way 3PLs and fragmented market in India also is going to look at it. John, one final question before we take a question from the audience is about, you have been a professor at SV Jain Center for Management and some other Australian university. What do you think should be the way we need to treat education, change education, and transform supply chain education to build the right kind of capabilities for this clock speed supply chains?
Yeah, well, look, I'm a bit of a critic on this. I have a first degree in engineering myself, but I did an MBA, and then, of course, then I specialised and went on and did my doctorate in the UK. I don't mind. My theory is I don't care what people do as an undergraduate. They can do anything. They can do arts. They can do whatever takes their fancy until they're old enough and mature enough to get interested in a field and go back and do some more study. I'm interested at the postgraduate level, which I think you are too, postgraduate and post-experience level, where by that time you're 30 years of age or something. You've figured out that what you want to do, and you seriously want to do something. What you don't want is more undergraduate finance or more marketing or more functional stuff. What you need is multidisciplinary subjects which sort of emulate the real world. I'm currently a visiting professor at SP Jain, which I know is Indian based, but it's also in Dubai and Sydney and Singapore. And each year, and I'm just doing it this year again, I'm taking a group of about 6 students from all over Asia, and we're going into a new startup company, which is only 3 years old. It's got some fantastic new track and trace type technology. And in addition to that, that's the supply chain bit, but they're also stepping into payment systems. And what we're looking at is saying, well, yes, if we can track a product all the way. Well, first of all, we go back to the start. If someone if business wants to buy a product, they can place an order. At the same time as they place the order, they put a certain amount of money in escrow. The supplier makes that product and starts to ship it, and so it's studied all the way through in terms of where it is, and when it gets to the buyer, there's a proximity sort of application that says, yep, this product is being delivered to this person, we know it is, proof of delivery, and as soon as that proof of delivery is done, the money in escrow is released to the supplier. So see what I'm saying? We're starting to get a mix of the supply chain and the financial systems. I think that's the next big exciting, and that's an example of a piece of the students that I'm working with on this. 2 of them are finance, 2 of them are marketing, 1 of them's data science. They're all specialists in their own way, but they need to understand how business works in the real world, and that's what I hope you will do more of, those sort of project-driven types of pieces of exploratory work, which end up being a great experience for the students, but could well end up having economic value for the people and companies involved.
Thank you, John, for such an enlightening talk and taking us through your understanding of transforming supply chains. We'll take some questions.
Yes, there is one question. Today in India, a big challenge to understand the integrated supply chain in the organizational leadership team. How should we implement new supply chain concept in our?
I think I can understand what's behind this question. The term supply chain is an unfortunate one in the context of a business, the same as the term for logistics, because we have functions called supply chain or logistics, which sit side by side with manufacturing and procurement and finance and sales. And so we get this sort of internecine sort of functional sort of stress between the functions. What I'm arguing is there's a difference between the supply chain function and the supply chain philosophy. The supply chain function is just like any other function. It carries out physical work, it runs distribution centers and manages transport contracts and, you know, gets the product out to the customer. That's fine. But what happens in companies that are organized that way is that marketing and finance and procurement, they all, once they've done their bit, they all wipe their hands of it and say, well, it's up to the supply chain or logistics people to deliver and do the rest. What people don't understand is that procurement, manufacturing, finance, marketing, logistics are all part of the horizontal flow, and that they actually contribute to that horizontal flow. So procurement contributes something, manufacturing contributes something, finance, marketing, and other, and bingo, we get a satisfied customer. So we've got this problem, and I think at the CEO level, they don't understand this, that philosophically, we are all in the supply chain, even though we chop up the work in some different ways. I think the best thing you can do is get your CEO to get some research done on the market, on the target market, and demonstrate to, and you can read about this in my book, Behavioural Segmentation. If you want more help, you can ask Rakesh and to contact me. But if you can demonstrate to your CEO that in your marketplace there are groups of customers with definitely different demands in terms of the speed of delivery, the type of packaging, the pricing structure, the branding. There's a combination of things. It's not just supply chain, it's the total package. It's the way people want to buy a product, and they want to buy it in different ways. If you can demonstrate to him that there are differences in your target market, he will then understand this idea that the supply chain philosophy inside the business has to be embraced, and that we do need different types of pathways, call them supply chains or call them pathways, that cross the business, and then we need teams of people seconded from the functions into these teams that drive these relationships of pathways or lean pathways or agile supply, and that people can rotate in and out of these teams. But we do need teams to drive that philosophy forward in a very real way. I can't think of a better way, because otherwise you end up being involved in opinions, you know, and if you're a junior in the organisation and you say to your boss, look, I think we should do this or that, he'll say, oh, go away, Sonny, you don't know what you're talking about. But if you say to him, this is what our this is fact, we've done the research, this is what our customers are saying they want, how should we reverse engineer back and change the way we digitize and put our processes together and put different teams of people and different mindsets and so on? How should we do that in order to get closer to aligning to these customers? Because until we do that, we're going to be wasting resources or missing sales or both. So don't get involved in the opinions, get involved in the fact, and then let them stew when they see they can't answer that when you show them the customers are different, and they can't deny then that we have to do something different inside the business. That's what we need, transformation. But the transformation has to be with that sort of target view. You can't just say one day, well, I think we'll have a transformation and go nowhere, because 75% of those sorts of transformations failed.
Is from Soumya Srinivasan. What are some of the skill sets any budding supply chain management enthusiasts need to upgrade to?
Look, my view about supply chain people is that they're not born, they're made. You know, you get supply chain people coming from finance, you have them coming out of engineering. You know, the more diverse the background, the better. But as we move into the sort of world we're moving into now, some of the really important skills that we need are data science, and data analysis and presentation. We've always had, you know, process re-engineering, industrial engineering, those sorts of things. But we also need people with a type of sales and marketing mindset as well to better represent the supply chain inside the business. Because in many businesses, supply chain is treated as a sort of one step disconnected from the customer. And we're always trying to, if you like, satisfy the customer without really knowing the customer. I'll tell you a story. When I started my work with Schneider Electric 9 years ago, the chief executive, who's French, had been trying for a couple of years to rebadge manufacturing people into the supply chain. And he just couldn't do it, because manufacturing people are very rigid. They have their mindset, and you know, in the new world, that's good there, but it's no good over here. And so what he finally did, which is brilliant, he went and hired Annette Clayton from Dell. And now she came out of Dell. She'd been working with Michael Dell in that fast-moving industry. She'd previously worked for General Motors. She came in and she had a much more of a customer mindset. And when we met in 2011, she immediately embraced the idea of yes, we've got to start at the customer end. Not we've got a great product and all that, but we need to understand how to reconfigure our network. And she embraced that. And our sales and marketing people were, you know, commercial people. They weren't all that interested. So what did she do? She didn't care. She just got budget and went out and did the research on her own. And we spent a lot of money. She spent a lot of money with us actually doing market research in South America, in India, China, in Australia, the Pacific, the US, all over the world. And what we found, the fascinating thing we found, was that for their sort of product, there was always a similar range of buying behaviors, but the mix changed. So the mix in North America was a bit different from the mix in South America, and the mix in India, and the mix in Pacific. But the same types of buying behaviors existed everywhere. And once we understood that, we basically were able to develop regional and global supply chains, which were all very similar looking. They just had a different focus, a slightly different emphasis. It wasn't as if we had to, come up with different supply chain, around each region. So the point I'm trying to make is that and as a result of that, we were able to develop, the right KPIs, people who, understood different KPIs for different supply chains. We were able to develop the different subcultures, the teams, the different technologies. They brought in Kinaxis to do a lot of their sort of second line work on top of their SAP ERP system. They started to put in track and trace, and then what they did finally, and this, we haven't talked about this tonight, they realized just how bad their master data files were. And no one in the company was taking responsibility for master data. And by the way, you can't do anything I've talked about tonight till you get your master data sorted out. And so they got a very good guy, senior vice president, out of the supply chain to take responsibility to get their master data files up to date, which they've done. And as a result, their whole digitization program has just accelerated in the last 2 or 3 years. So, the shorter answer is you need a diverse range of skills, but certainly people who can cleanse data, who can manage digitization, but starting from that customer end and interpret what that means in terms of the network and run. That's the other thing. I talked them into developing network modeling teams, which they did, and they developed network models all over the place, and that gave them some real focus on where to close DCs and open new DCs and put in manufacturing in different locations. And it was all based on science. So I think the thing I'd end on, Rakesh, is that we're no longer guessing. We're trying to make supply chain part of the sort of scientific field of management here. And we've made a lot of headway, but there's still a lot more to do. But certainly the data and the digital side of it is important, but that you only get to that once you've got the big architecture, which is all involved in understanding what your customers are telling you they want and what that means in terms of infrastructure and network. And then you can underpin that with digitization.
I think I'll add something to this. John has put up very well. Let me focus on summarizing them and giving a little perspective on that. See, 3 things are very critical for you to build your capabilities. 1, you need to be critically thinking about business. IT is an enabler. You have to subsume IT into the business. Unless you understand the business and you have a proper understanding of the larger dynamics of industry and business, you are not going to be a great supply chain management. Second, you need to be analytical. Does it mean you need to be only data science? Not necessarily. You need to be able to make meaning out of data sciences, analytics, all those heuristic and big kiosks that exist with the data. And with big data, what happens is that you can really get patterns within data. And if you can interpret data to make decisions according to the business reality, that's an important element of your capability. The third is very critical: communication. And this is not pure simple communication. Your ability to adopt your critical thinking and analytical thinking to put your planning issues, your optimization issues, your supply chain end-to-end integration and alignment issues effectively with data and their impact on various functional areas is a very critical area. And the fourth one, which we all forget, and I think none of us talk about it in a function, it's not even functional, because we deal with a firm. We need to know the geography of your business, whether it's global, local. You need to know the macroeconomics of your business. How is the macroeconomy actually going to really move in a what way? And third is regulatory. I think John has written in his book, and we did not have much time to deal with that, is sustainability. How are you going to really look at sustainability as a challenging factor and build, along with your geopolitical, economic nationalism changes, macroeconomic parameter changes? Look at after pandemic, so much of uncertainty, but so much of optimism also. Yesterday they said India will grow by 11.8%. Now I think there's optimism and pessimism. How do you build in what if scenarios? How do you do scenario planning? In fact, as John talks about Kinaxis, and there's a lot of them are now inbuilting the scenario planning into that. But please remember, why do we really fail when we have such a APS system operating in our planning and optimization framework? Because these are black boxes. You don't know what are the business needs, and you don't marry the business need to algorithm. Algorithms dominate business needs. The current set of education and training and development of the executive requires you to understand supply chain principles, old principles, in a more dynamic way, more analytically, in a more what if critical manner, and in a scenario manner as the scenario changes. Look at this. We are moving back to India for Atmanirbhar. There is Australia also having. There are so many geopolitical problems. You don't understand, you don't do the business. There are short-term impact, long-term impact, and this thing. And thirdly, most of us are very much with supply side synchronization. We get very, very happy with that. Please adopt a planning approach for supply chain strategy and know where you fit your short run, your mid run, and your long run in this changing dynamic. And there's so much of enough data to help you out. So I think it is strategic way of looking at. I think many people will have to pave way for such thinkers in supply chain. And this is very critical, because if you have your numbers, you can communicate, you know your business, you can convince anyone in your SNOP or integrated business planning, which are the epitome of your transition or your contribution in the strategic planning. So that's what you need.
Yeah.
Hope John agrees with that, or he has an opinion on that.
Absolutely, I agree with that. And, you know, I go back to the point where I started. We're in for a rough ride in the next 10 years or so for all sorts of reasons. We're going to have more and more disruptions. Those disruptions are going to make it very difficult, I think, Rakesh, to do conventional forecasting. And, you know, what it means is, and I was doing some things with a company in South Africa a few months ago, and they grow blueberries, and they had a huge crop of blueberries coming along, and they normally sell these into Europe, into the big supermarkets over in Europe. But they didn't have a clue what, you know, given COVID, you know, what was the demand going to be? And, you know, and I said to them, this would have been an ideal situation to have a ready-to-go model. In other words, build a network model of your network, and you know, and you can then run what ifs. You can try different things. You can look at the capacities involved in transport, and you can make some, you know, decisions. But if you don't have that sort of help, that sort of analytical help, you're just guessing, and it can be very serious disruption and very costly. So there's a lot of things to think about here, but the closing point I would make would be that it would be around resilience. We haven't mentioned that word. It's overworked word, but it is true that a lot of the things we talked about tonight, you know, being quicker, digitization, visibility in the supply chain, are all going to make us more resilient and be able to cope with this volatility, so we can catch the up and we can minimize the damage when things drop out. And these are all the things, and so I think the supply chain manager is going to be the general manager of the corporation, because if I tell you some numbers, in a typical manufacturing company, around 80% of the capital investment is in supply chain things like manufacturing facilities, DCs, and things of the nature. And about 65% of the working capital is also in supply chain. That's inventory, inventory carrying costs, etc. So when you think of it like that, I'm arguing that just about every company around is actually a supply chain company. Now, we don't want to get too extreme and sort of go like that, but you know, deep down, this is the way you've got to think. You don't want to be bullied by other people in the organisation. You want to stand up and say, hey, we're all in the business of servicing customers, and we'll run the framework for you, but we need your cooperation, and try and get some internal cooperation going, which, by the way, during COVID has increased a lot. I've spoken to a lot of my clients around the world, and they've said one of the nice things that's come out of COVID, that there's been a lot of internal improvement in cooperation between functions. So that's good.
Thank you, John. And I think as we have, we are on dot. The time for the program is, we have subsumed the time. Thank you very much for giving us a very agile, very efficient, and very resilient framework for managing transformation in the supply chain, and calling every supply chain is a supply chain organization. And I think there are so many of them. Even Michael Porter, the guru of strategy, says that value chain. And if you look at the concept of value chain, it is nothing but vertical and horizontal integration. In a way, it is only supply chain. And every other function, he calls it as a support function to the supply chain. Even in the in fact, the only textbook on strategy that exists, and that's acknowledged. So I think supply chains are living lifeline of organizations, and everything around that.
It's really an ecosystem. Yeah.
Yeah. And we need to really move towards, building up our capabilities, our understanding. John is a proponent of building thought leadership within your own organization, so that you can actually make people critically think, analytically decide, and communicate this change across the chain, so that you can gain a strategic and a competitive differentiation for your competitive advantage. So thank you very much for being a part of this discussion. And I would like to thank my friend John for supporting us always. And John has been, a great support to ISCM. He's also on our academic board as a chairman. So this John has been special to us. Thank you, John, for sharing your thought on transforming supply chain. And I also thank Institute of Supply Chain team, which has brought about this, and brought all of you to the forum. Thank you.